On April 19th, 1951, General Douglas MacArthur addressed Congress for the last time. He talked about threats in the Pacific, especially threats with China. He urged the American Congress especially to support Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and especially the island of Formosa, Taiwan. He said, don't ever let that go. We need that as a stronghold. At the end of his talk, he said this: I have just left your fighting sons in Korea during the Korean War. They have met all tests there, and I can report to you without reservation that they are splendid in every way. It was my constant effort to preserve them and end this savage conflict honorably and with the least loss of time and a minimum sacrifice of life. Its growing bloodshed has caused me the deepest anguish and anxiety. Those gallant men will remain often in my thoughts and in my prayers always. I'm closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath of on the plane at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away, an old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye. That was the end of his speech. Last words are usually summaries, what we want people to know. I don't know if you ever thought about what your last words might be, or what you might want to be, sort of a last address or a last thing that you'd want to impart to those that you loved who are maybe gathered around to hear you say something. Maybe you don't do a lot of thinking about that, but I do from time to time. I think about things like that. The idea, I think, of last words is, listen, if you hear one thing from me, let it be this. Let it be this thing that I want you to know about. It's hard to summarize your life early on. It's always kind of funny to me when people write memoirs and they're young. You know, Bill Clinton wrote his at 58, and he's been on the scene for 20 years since he wrote his memoirs. He's done a lot of other things. Simone Biles wrote her memoirs at age 19. She's done a lot since then even. Miley Cyrus wrote hers at 16. And it's just like, okay, well, I'm sure you've had some experiences at 16, but you're only 16. How can you write about your life? You don't have the wisdom that comes with living a long life and looking back and being able to put all those life lessons into something. And so what we've been looking at in the life of Job is kind of not just an argument, but kind of an overview of his life. The book starts off just giving us the description that Job was a righteous man, one that feared God and eschewed evil. But then from going back and forth, you'd almost wonder if maybe that wasn't true, because his friends are saying, well, all this has happened to you. It must be that you're wicked. And Job has tried to defend himself. In the last 2 chapters, he said, listen, this was my life before all this happened. I was a righteous man. I helped my community. I was trying to do the best I could with what I had. And so Job now, he's talked about everything, and he's kind of said everything he can say, but now chapter 31 are kind of his last words. In fact, look at the very last verse here in Job 31. The very last, 6 words, the words of Job are ended. Now, whether he said that and sat down, or whether the one who was copying all this down or wrote it down, either way, this is the end of what Job has to say. Now, we'll still hear from him, but it's going to be much shorter, and you'll read a lot more contrition than you will hear tonight. So this is what Job has to say, and he's been speaking of his righteousness, the nature of God, and how God deals with mankind. His friends have not believed him. They've not gone to check on the stories he's told about how he's helped people, the fatherless, the orphans, the widows, those kind of people. They've just said, well, it must be that you're wicked. They've kind of just put Job in a box and said, I know it doesn't always fit, but here it is. So now he ends his speeches. He said his piece, and he's insisting on his righteousness. But in insisting in his righteousness, he's also holding up what is right. He's saying, listen, I have been righteous. And what he talks about are things that we as Christians ought to aspire to, and matters of integrity that we ought to hold up as virtuous. So it's not just Job telling us what he's done, but also saying, listen, this is the right kind of life to live. So what can we aspire to? If we were to write our own obituary, if we were to put our last words in, what would we say? Like Douglas MacArthur saying, I've tried to do my duty. If we were going to say, this is what I've done, could you aspire to these things that Job is going to talk about? He first has an acknowledgement of God's vision over all, or God's watching over all. In chapter 31, verse 2, what portion of God is there from above? And what inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is not destruction to the wicked, and a strange punishment to the workers of iniquity? Doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? He says it's important to remember that God sees and reacts to our behavior, that God sees everything that we do. Now, again, throughout the book of Job, we've said it's not a one-to-one ratio where this happens and God acts in that way always. That's been the major contention of the book of Job, that no, there isn't well, if I do this, then I expect this from God. But it is true that God does see what we do, and he reacts either positively with reward or negatively with punishment. Not always, but in general, that is the case. And what he's saying here is that's important for us to remember as we're living our life. I've always thought about God's watching over everything that I'm doing. In 1 Peter 3, verse 12, he says it this way, the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open unto their prayers, but the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. And there are many other verses I could talk to you tonight about how God sees what we do. When we do it in secret, we think we're in secret, but God sees it. The darkness is as light to him, he says in Psalm 139. So now there are better reasons to obey God, but remembering that God's face is watching you and seeing you is one of those reasons. Now, what should this cause us to do? Two things. One, to take necessary steps to limit sinful temptations. I skipped over verse 1 because I wanted to make the point, but now let's go back to verse number 1. Job starts off by saying, I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? He's talking about the sin of adultery. Now, again, you can't eliminate all sinful temptations because Jesus was tempted, right? If he passed the test, but temptation is just going to be a part of life. But isn't it true as well that there are things that you can do that can limit the kinds of temptations that Satan would throw at you? You can put up some guardrails so that when Satan comes to tempt you, it just isn't going to stick like it might for you in a different situation or somebody else. There are things that you can do. And what Job says is that he decided beforehand, he made a covenant with his eyes, that he wouldn't look upon a woman and start to think about her in a way that would be impure, or in a way that he might think about his wife, but it's not his wife, it's this other woman. And he says, I made a covenant, I made a determination that because God sees everything that I do, that I'm going to make sure that I think about other people, other women, in a right way and not in a wrong way. It's good to take steps in the situation before the situation than in the situation. For instance, and I'm not speaking from experience necessarily, but it is, I imagine it's more difficult when you're alone with someone of the opposite sex to resist the temptation. Especially maybe when you were younger. You know, when you're in your teens, in your early 20s, just that temptation to fornication was a lot more when it was at night and you were alone. And so it's just good to put some guardrails in where that sort of thing isn't going to happen. And whatever it is in your life, whatever that thing that Satan knows, do you have some guardrails in your life to set up so that you can say, yeah, that's just not going to be Not that I'm a super Christian, but like I know that's where Satan wants me, and I'm just not going to go in these places and do these kinds of things that are going to bring me into contact with sinful temptation. Does God have a way for you to escape? Absolutely, 100%. Does God also want us to use wisdom to make sure that we don't get into that position where we need his escape? Yes, there's prudence there. So that's one principle that thinking about God's face watching over us should cause us to do, to eliminate, as best we can, to eliminate sinful temptations. But two, to remember that there's a judgment day. Look at verse number 4. Doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? If I've walked with vanity, or if my foot hath hasted to deceit, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity. There's a day that your works will be judged. You'll be weighed in the balances, and God will say, this is what you've done. And the Bible talks about this in a different way in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. Now, if any man build upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every man's work of what sort it is. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. It goes on to say, if you've done these other things, it'll get burned up and you'll still be saved. But the idea is there's a judgment day coming. So the idea that God is watching over us ought to cause us to say, hey, I better be careful of what I'm doing. And Job is saying that idea of God watching over me has really caused me to do righteous things. And again, I don't want you to come to the end of your life and say, I wish I would have remembered that God is always watching me, that God is always looking over the things that I'm doing. To hold that up so that at the end of your life you can say, remembering that God was watching over me, now I'm ready to meet him. I'm not going to meet him with shame because I didn't listen in those private moments, but to be able to say, God is watching over me, he is looking after me, and that can be a great thing. It can be a fearful thing if you're not doing the right thing. So there's an acknowledgement of God's vision or God's watching over all. Second, there's an acknowledgement of the destructiveness of sin. In this chapter, if we just read the whole thing at once, which we didn't do, I'm just taking it in little chunks. It's quite a long chapter, and I thought, well, rather than reading the whole thing as a church, we'll just read it little by little. And my hope is always that the next time you read through the book of Job, it's going to be a lot easier for you to read because we've gone through it together. Hopefully you've taken some notes and you can say, oh yeah, this is kind of what he is talking about here in this verse. And I probably haven't done a very good job of looking at every single verse to everyone's satisfaction, but trying to at least get some of the bigger picture items. But in chapter 31, it's almost like he's invoking a curse upon himself. And he says a series of this, like, if I have done this sin, then let this bad thing happen to me, right? And the things he mentions, of course, aren't the things that actually happened to him, but he's saying, listen, I'm telling you the truth that I've done the right kinds of things. And if I'm lying, if I'm saying the opposite thing, if I've done those things, then let this other horrible thing happen to me. It's meant, again, to be an oath that he has been righteous, he's walked in his integrity. He's asserting that being holy is important because he has tried. So let's look at some of these if I have statements. In verses 7 and 8. If my step hath turned out of the way, and mine heart walked after mine eyes, and if any blot hath cleaved to mine hands, then let me sow, and let another eat. Yea, let my offspring be rooted out. He says, if I followed my own lusts, then let my fruits be taken from me. He says, I don't deserve to eat of my labors if I've sabotaged my way with sin. If I've tried to walked in some crooked way to try to get an advantage, then all the good that I've been trying to heap up for myself, all that should be taken away. And again, I'm sure his friends are saying, well, that's kind of what happened to you. What he's saying is, I've walked in my integrity, and if I'm lying, and if all this is because of my crookedness, then may God take even more away from me. Verses 9 and 10 is another if I have statement. If mine heart have been deceived by a woman, or if I have laid wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind into another, and let others bow down upon her. He's saying, if I've committed adultery, then let my wife be taken, let her become a slave and abused by others. That's how serious he is about how righteous he's been. Again, just like it is important for me to have this integrity in place, and for everyone to know that I've tried to do my best to walk with God. Why? Because in verses 11 and 12, he talks about how sin is destructive. He's saying, listen, I've tried to walk with God because in verse 11, for this is an heinous crime. Yea, it is an iniquity to be punished by the judges. For it is a fire that consumeth to destruction and would root out all mine increase. I'm aware of the consequences of sin, Job says. It shows that fire devours. The other day, I was in the house somewhere, and Ben and Jake were looking for something, I think for a science experiment, and Ben found a little box of matches, and he pulled it out. He said, Dad, can I light this? And I just looked at him like, what? Why would I say yes to that question? Is there a candle? Is there, what are we doing here? He just wanted to light it because it was fun. Well, I shouldn't probably tell you that it was a couple weeks ago that he was cooking something on the stove, and I got a call from the alarm company that Lorraine has at her house that there was a fire at the house, and they couldn't get a hold of anybody, and so I had to rush home quick and say, what's going on here? And it was a big mess. Thankfully, they didn't call the fire department, and there was no fire, but it was Ben. So if Ben is going to burn bacon on the stove, I'm sure not going to let him light a match. You know, our concrete guy this week, so we had some of the styrofoam things that are going on our house were kind of left over, and I said, I'll just take those to the dump. He's like, oh, usually we just put them in a pile and burn them. And I'm like, why would you do that? I'm like, there's leaves everywhere. It's really, really dry. I'm like, that seems like a terrible idea. No, I'll just take them to the dump. I really don't mind. But he's just like, oh yeah, we'll just build a fire. And I thought, do you not know the way that fire works? Because that could be a really bad thing. I'm sure he would have been careful or whatever. It was just one of those things where like, no, that could really get out of hand. And the last thing I want is my whole property to go up in flames because you thought it was fine to burn some styrofoam on the property here, right? So sin is destructive. Sin can make us lose everything that we have. And as you get older, I think you see the danger of trifling with sin. If you're like Job, admitting the danger of sin, it shows that you know and that you're serious about staying away from it. You know, I was talking with Jeff Shergalis when they were here this summer. He had just been to Alaska visiting some churches up there, and he said they went out on a snowmobile, and they said basically if you see a black bear, it's generally fine. You're not going to see black bear up there, but they said if you see a black bear, you really don't have very much to worry about. If you see a grizzly bear, then you know you want to make sure that you give it lots of room. But if you see a polar bear, just run. Like there's nothing. If a black bear comes upon you, you're supposed to scare it. If a grizzly bear comes against you, then you play dead and hope that it just loses interest. But if you see a polar bear, you're dead. And he said that the pastor is with him. They were just always looking around, and if they spotted a polar bear anywhere, they said, all right, it's time to go. It could be like a mile away, and they're like, doesn't matter, right? That shows, like, you know the seriousness of it. If you're like, oh, that's a sinful thing, I'm going to stay away from that, that shows, hey, I really know the destructiveness of this sin. He's acknowledging the destructiveness of sin. And that's important. Job is not one to take sin lightly. He's taking it seriously, and he's showing that. Then there's the acknowledgement of the obligation to help others. Now, Job has already said in the last 2 chapters that he was a help to others. He was a blessing to the poor. And so Job, in his wealth, realized that he had an obligation to help others, especially as a wealthy person, right? He says God sees it and expects that we would be a blessing. And Job has done that, right? God has expected that. God's given him wealth, and he has been a blessing. Why is this that Job says it's important for me to help others? Well, verse 15 shows us, did not he that made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb? Meaning this, I'm not any better than anybody else. I'm not better than the servant. I'm not better than the shepherd. I'm not better than the poor person. Again, he had some pretty harsh things to say about some of the poor people in last chapter because they were deriding him. But he's saying, listen, God made us both. I'm not any better than anybody. We're both made in God's image. But because of that, then I have an obligation to help them, to help these people. So we have now, again, another series of if I have statements. Verse 13. If I did despise the cause of my manservant or of my maidservant when they contended with me, what then shall I do when God riseth up And when he visiteth, what shall I answer him? If I have abused one of my servants, may God make me answer for it. God cares about those who serve. God cares about those in a low position. And if people are in a low position and somebody else comes along and tries to put them in a lower position, God cares about that. I was listening to a sermon as I was cleaning the church yesterday, and it was a sermon that was it was unrelated to Job, but it was on a different topic. But he said something that I thought was really good. So, and I'll probably use this in a sermon again. So if you hear this again, I'm just thinking over. I really like what he said. He said this. If you read in James, he says, "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He shall lift you up." He said, so it's your job to humble yourself, and God's job to exalt you. And he said, but if you don't do your job, and you do His job to exalt yourself, then He'll have to do your job and humble you. And I'm like, that's really good. I like that, So if I'm someone I'm going to exalt myself over somebody else who they're abased, then God's going to exalt them and humble me. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather, like the story, the parable that Jesus told, to go to the lowest room if you go to a feast and let them say, come up, to humble yourself first and let God put you in the position He wants you to have. That's much better than being humbled. And Job is saying, I've cared about those who are serving because I know that God's going to make me answer for that. Look at verses 16 through 22. Again, these are if I have statements. If I have withheld the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel myself alone, and the fatherless have not eaten thereof, for from my youth he was brought up with me as with a father, and I have guided her from my mother's womb. If I have seen any perish for want of clothing, or any poor without covering, if his loins have not blessed me, and if he were not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the fatherless when I saw my help in the gate, then let mine arm fall from my shoulder blade, and mine arm be broken from the bone. All right, again, he says, if I refuse to help the poor, may I lose my abilities to do everything else. If I won't use my fleece of my sheep to warm other people, to be a blessing to them, if I won't take the things that I have and use my arms to create something that might be a blessing and a help to somebody else, then what's the use of even having them? May my arms fall off, is what he says. That's, again, showing it's important to help the poor. Psalm 140, verse 12, I know that the Lord will maintain the cause of the afflicted and the right of the poor. Well, I don't want to fight with God. A poor person might be easy to fight with, but if God's defending the poor, I don't want to fight with God. In Proverbs 17:5, whoso mocketh the poor reproacheth his maker, and he that is glad at calamities shall not be unpunished. Job is serious about his dealing with the poor. It's an acknowledgement of the obligation to help others. It's easy to do things for those who would help us, for those who might be able to repay us someday, to be a blessing to us someday. But God wants us to help those who can never repay us. We need to trust Him to repay us and to see what's happening. God, do you see that I'm helping your people, the poor? I'm doing what I can to be a blessing to them. And God promises that He will repay. Job says, I was serious about this. I was serious about this. He's not blaming God. He's just saying, listen, I have helped the poor, and I'm showing you how serious I am. If I haven't helped the poor, then let my arms fall off. It's an acknowledgement, then, of the need for rest or trust in the Lord. Job saw the great need to put his trust in the Lord, not in man and not in himself. Job, like Solomon, knew the draw of wealth and how easy it is to trust in yourself. It's true, isn't it, that most of the things we worry about have to do with the number that's in our bank account. And when that number is bigger, our worries tend to go down. Because there are a lot of things, money can't buy happiness, but money can buy a lot of things. It can buy a lot of things that would take away stress and worry. And so if we're not careful, there's this temptation to want to get more so that we can worry less instead of just worrying less, right? You can easily, if you have money, take care of your enemies. And whereas Solomon failed the test through Ecclesiastes and through the book of 1 Kings, you find out that Solomon failed that test of wealth. Job actually thrived and did well with it. Says in his if I have statements, look at verses 24 through 28. He says, if I've trusted in my riches, if I've wanted more, then let me be judged. Verse 24, if I have made gold my hope, or have said to the fine gold, thou art my confidence. If I rejoiced because my wealth was great, and because mine hand had gotten much. If I beheld the sun when it shined, and the moon walking in brightness, and my heart hath been secretly enticed, or my mouth hath kissed my hand, this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judge. For I should have denied the God that is above. He says, if I've trusted in my riches, then let me be judged. If I've put my confidence in my riches, if I'm resting in my wealth and not the Lord, let God see it. Now, this idea in verse number, and I had to look this up, verse number 27, my heart hath been secretly enticed, or my mouth hath kissed my hand. Most commentators think that that's this thing of going like this and then touching the idol. So it's kind of a worship of another idol, or giving credence or credit to some other deity that didn't actually do anything. He says, if I've done that, let God judge me. If I've trusted in my own abilities, if I've trusted in my own wealth, then let this is like a denial of God. Now it's interesting, isn't it? If you read the chapter 1, Job didn't take for granted that just because he was wealthy, that his children were going to be fine. Remember in Job chapter 1, he would often make sacrifices to the Lord on behalf as an intercessory for his children, saying, maybe it is that they're partying and feasting and they've accidentally cursed God in their heart. And he's like, I just got to look after them. I want to watch over them and make sure that they're not under God's wrath and judgment. So again, he learned, even in those wealthy moments, before he lost everything, to trust in the Lord. He says in verses 29 through 31, if I tried to get revenge, that's wrong as well. Verse 29, if I rejoice at the destruction of him that hated me, or lifted up myself when evil found him, neither have I suffered my mouth to sin by wishing a curse to his soul. If the men of my tabernacle said not, oh, that we had his flesh, we cannot be satisfied. And this is the idea again that Job had people that were against him, and he said, I didn't even want to, wish them a curse in my own heart. Not even that he said, hey, manservant, go get that guy. He said, even just in my own heart, if I didn't, I am not one that was wishing ill on my enemies. I wasn't complaining to the people in my tabernacle or his servants, the people that were in his tent. I wasn't complaining to them about what was going on, so they felt like they had to go and do something about it. He says, I was depending on the Lord to meet this conflict problem. He says in verse 33, if I covered my transgressions as Adam by hiding my iniquity in my bosom. He says, again, if I tried to hide my sins, let me turn out just like Adam did. I wasn't trying to hide them. I'm trying to put them right out there. Job isn't saying I'm sinless, but he says, when I sin, I bring it out in the open. I say, God, here it is. Verses 38 and 40, he says, if I've done wrong, let my land be cursed with weeds. Going down to verse 38, if my land cry against me, or that the furrows likewise thereof complain, if I've eaten the fruits thereof without money, or have caused the owners thereof to lose their life, let thistles grow instead of wheat, and cockle instead of barley. If I've done wrong, let my land be cursed with weeds. Job has trusted in the Lord. He seemed like a fool to others, but he'll continue to trust God. And part of what his friends didn't understand is that Job had been walking with God. And I think that's the thing that confused and hurt him the most, that he really thought he knew God well, and all of a sudden all this stuff happened. His orientation wasn't toward men. Look at verse 34. Did I fear a great multitude, or did the contempt of families terrify me, that I kept silence and went not out the door? He's like, when there was right to be done, I didn't let what other people thought of that sway me. I didn't stay inside and stay quiet just because people didn't like my decision. I would stand up for what's right. And again, as always, when something is inexplicable, when we say, I just don't understand what's going on here, that variable that we just don't know the answer to, it's better to not move away from God's character. The thing that you know is who God is. The thing you don't know is why this is happening. And Job is just saying, listen, I walked in my integrity. I know that God saw everything I do. I don't know why all this happened. But I do know that God's a good God, and that I've walked in my integrity, that God's seen all of it, and that God rewards the righteous. Now, again, Job was right. Job was right. Because at the very end, we'll see that God restores everything that he lost, even more than that. That doesn't mean that we don't question God at times. And here is a particularly, Job's had some low moments. And here in his last words is a low moment. And I think this is maybe what prompts chapters 38 through 41 when God shows up. But listen to this, verse 35. Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, and that mine adversary had written a book. Surely I would take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown to me. I would declare unto him the number of my steps. As a prince would I go near unto him. If my land, verse 37 is where I'm going to stop. He says, I wish I could talk to the Almighty. I wish I could tell him my way, right? If only I had the chance to give my side of the story, he says. He knows in his heart that God does know all of this, but he's frustrated to think that he didn't deserve it. And when he thinks about his righteousness and where that righteousness has gotten him, he says, I just feel like I want answers. I want to go and demand of God if I could. If he was a prince, I would find out where he is and I would go and I'd talk to him. I'd take my book of grievances and I'd show it to him and I'd say, you've not been fair. If only I had the chance to give my side of the story. Have you ever had that where you feel like, man, if I just had like 5 minutes with that person, I could explain what I was thinking, my motives, how all of this happened. If I could just have just that little bit of time, I'd figure this out. You ever had that? You ever actually had those moments and then realized like it didn't actually do any good? Because we don't always get the chance to explain to people what was really going on. It has to sometimes just be what it is. Or if we get a chance, it might only be one chance. You get one chance to try to explain yourself to somebody. And if you even get one chance, that explanation may not sway them, and you might want more. Well, if I had another chance. Well, if I had to do it over again. In the end, people are going to do what they want. You can explain everything. It's logical, and you can talk to everybody else, and everybody else would say, yep, that makes sense. That's logical. They should have made that decision, and in the end, they might just not. I talked with somebody recently that was very frustrated at what they felt was they needed a chance to be able to explain to people what was really going on, and they were just really pretty desperate to be able to have that opportunity. And trying to I watched the frustration in the person's face as they're trying to say, I just want this, and just not having the heart to tell them, you'll probably never get that. It's not maybe right, it's just the way that it is. And here's Job, and unfortunately, Job in chapters 38 through 41 never gets an answer from God about why all this happened. But God does at least affirm what Job says in chapter 31. You're right, Job. You have acknowledged that I see everything, that I'm over all, that sin is really destructive, that you do have an obligation to help others, and you have done that, that you need to rest and trust in me. You've acknowledged that, and that's good. As Job makes his demands, he should realize in his last moments, in these last words, that God hears all of it, and God cares, and that he should just keep the faith as he understands who God is. And may God help us to do the same thing. God help us as we look at our own lives and as we face trials and things that we're not sure how it's going to go. Help us, Lord, to rest in you. In Jesus' name.